I think I knew about the Feldmans before I actually met them. People would talk about them and the work that they did. They're from Chicago originally for a long time at least, and then they moved to kind of a little near St. Joe, Benton Harbor, which I tend to hang out a lot at. And so I'd heard about some of their work and things from other people, and then when I met them, it was everything. Sometimes people are billed and you have this great expectation and then they don't live up to it. They've definitely lived up to it. I mean, they are two of the warmest, most loving people, accepting that you'd ever meet. And I think it comes out in their book as well as hopefully their talk tonight. And they're scholars. They're both educated to be psychotherapists, and they do that, still have their practices. But they're also out in the community trying to make the world a better place. They've started things like the Race Relations Council, All God's Children Choir, Calling All Colors. I'll talk about some of these groups that really they've tried to change the St. Joe, Benton Harbor area and beyond. They actually started their work about the same time, or maybe slightly before, a book came out. It's called The Other Side of the River, and it was a pretty popular book about St. Joe, Benton Harbor, and how racially segregated they were, and how it was kind of the paradigm example in America of racial divide. And I think things are a little better. There's certainly a long ways to go, but I think a lot of the advancements have at least a small part, probably a large part, to do with Larry and Sandy's work. And so with that, I'll turn it over to them. And please give a warm welcome for Larry and Sandy Feldman.
Thank you, Andy. Such a nice guy. You all are so lucky to have him here. I'm grateful that you made time to come. I can imagine that you're all torn in many different directions. This issue is really important to us, and we wanted to share what our experiences have been and hopefully generate some interest in some of you to take some actions that will help make the world a better place. Larry and I were both active in the civil rights movement. I was in St. Louis, Missouri. He was in Baltimore, Maryland. We both ended up professionally in Chicago, and we lived in Oak Park, which is a pretty stably integrated community. And we were feeling as though things were going well in Oak Park, and then got word that some of the parents were disappointed that their kids, who had friendships across racial and ethnic and religious lines in preschool and in grade school and in the beginning of junior high, were starting to segregate, it seemed spontaneously, by the end of junior high and in high school. And they couldn't figure out what's happening. We live in an integrated area, we buy the right books, they watch Sesame Street, we're giving them the right messages. So they had a forum, and fortunately they were smart enough to ask the kids and say, what's going on? We don't understand. We've made these choices that we thought would influence your choices. And the kids said to them essentially, you know, you talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk. They said, look at the people that you go out with on a Saturday night when you go to a restaurant or to see a play. Look at the people that come to the hospital when grandma had her stroke. Look at the people that you're exchanging recipes with and working in the garden. The reality is you tell a story about who we should welcome into our lives, but the people that are close to you are people that look a lot like you. And so they began this organization that we joined there called Project Unity, where we met as large groups and then broke into small groups. Those groups read books together, and we talked and we stayed together over time. We did things socially together, and we had incredibly frank discussions in a world where, unfortunately, there aren't many of those conversations that endure over time. About 6 months ago, Larry and I were in Berkeley, California for a conference that was brought together by John Powell, who's a civil rights lawyer, brilliant African-American scholar, and he started this conference called Othering and Belonging. And he said, I need people that are committed to bringing folks together so they actually know each other and they stop othering each other, and then we can actually begin to work together for social change. So the first year there were 120, and then there were 530, and this year when we went, there were 1,500 people. And it was a powerful experience, and one of the things he did in the beginning is say an African word and tell us that the translation for that word is, I see you. And he asked us to take a minute and ask the person that was sitting nearest to us that we didn't know, not somebody we came to the conference with, and ask for their name. And then to look in that person's eyes and say, I see you, Mary. I see you, George. And it was striking what a powerful moment that was. And he talked about how rarely we actually pause and see the other person, and how easy it is to divide into us and them if we don't have any authentic relationships and we don't know the other person's story. So that was a really powerful experience, and we realized that when we moved after some years in Oak Park to Southwest Michigan, it was a jarring experience. It felt a little bit like going back to 1950. Kids in Southwest Michigan, in the area where we live in Lakeside, which is about a half hour south of St. Joe Benton Harbor. They could go from preschool to graduating high school and never be in a class with a student with a racial or ethnic background different than their own. That's somewhat different now with schools of choice, but that's actually opened some other challenges. So when we moved there, we thought we ought to do something about sharing the lessons we've learned in Project Unity. And Larry saw an article in the paper that said Lake Michigan College was responding to Alex Kotlowitz's book and the national outcry about the racial divide in Southwest Michigan by bringing people together to see if they wanted to form an organization to address this in an ongoing way. So Larry said, I think we could probably find that college. It's probably not far away. We'll just list the things that worked and those things that didn't work in Oak Park, and hopefully that'll help those folks get launched, but we won't get over-involved. And then we went and got over-involved. And by the time we left that night, we'd signed up for 5 committees and were part of starting 4 initiatives. And the good news is that those initiatives are alive 20 years later. And one of the things that's so disheartening, at least for us, when we look at the time we've spent in the trenches and the people that we've been able to partner with, is to see how much time it takes to make progress and how many people abandon efforts after a month or 2 months or 3 months. So the fact that we've had these partners working together in these initiatives for 20 years and it's borne some fruit has made what we think is a big difference. There's a ripple effect. The people that have been in these projects have impact on their families and on the other people in their block and the other kids in their classrooms. So we thought we really ought to try to commit some of those lessons learned to paper so that people could do some things in their community that might be helpful there as well. The principles that we talk about in the book, though, don't only apply to beginning initiatives, starting programs, gathering people into an organization. They also make a difference in terms of how you're relating on a day-to-day life to the people sitting next to you on the bus, are sitting next to you in a new class, are working in the same cubicle at your office. We talked in Chicago on Monday, and a woman said to us afterwards, you know, it didn't dawn on me that I've worked on the same projects with an African American woman in my company for 20 years, and neither of us actually know anything about the other person. Like, I don't know if she has kids. I don't know if she's from this area. We're polite to each other, but we don't actually know one another. And knowing one another is so critical. And having conversations that are authentic and genuine and where we stick our neck out and we tolerate being uncomfortable for a few minutes is so important. So I want you to think about this in terms of immediate interpersonal relationships and opportunities for interpersonal relationships, as well as initiatives that might fit with something that you might want to do, or concepts that you could employ in organizations that you're already a part of. I think that we are largely guided by two quotes that we've been holding on to for years. One was Dr. King, who said, "We fear one another because we don't know one another. We don't know one another because we're so often separate from one another." And the other quote was about 20 years ago, we were at a talk given by John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, who's one of our heroes. And he concluded his words by saying, "When you pray, move your feet. When you pray, move your feet." And we were thinking about how often people talk about how they wish it were different, and how they wish we weren't burdened with prejudice and discrimination, and how they feel badly about there have been these barriers, this uneven playing field. But they're not moving their feet. They're not actually rolling up their sleeves to think about, well, is there something I could do that would actually make this be different? And so we thought, well, we better move our feet. And so we began All God's Children Community Choir, which we'll tell you something about. We began Calling All Colors, which is a diversity education program for the schools. We began the Race Relations Council. This is with those other folks in that initial group. And we developed a course for Lake Michigan College for the psych department called The Psychology of Stereotypes and Prejudice. And so Larry's going to share with you some of the research. He's a research guy. He was with the Family Institute at Northwestern in Chicago. Research is his love. Stories are my love. So he's going to share with you some of the research that supports our work.
Research and you are my love, my dear.
Oh my gosh. Whoa. Didn't even know that was coming.
So the basis of our work is diversity. And for us, in writing the book, we talk about racial diversity, but the principles that we want to talk with you about apply to all forms of diversity. So the first question that we wanted to address is, why is diversity important? Why does diversity matter? And there are a number of answers to that question. First and foremost, on the basis of decades of research, it is clear that bringing people into contact with one another across racial and ethnic lines, but also across other lines of difference, in positive ways, and we will tell you momentarily what we mean by positive ways, is by far the most effective way to reduce stereotypes and prejudice. And if we can reduce stereotypes and prejudice, we can reduce discrimination. And if we can eliminate discrimination, then maybe we can finally live in a society in which everybody has an equal opportunity. And sadly, we still are far from that ideal. We've made some steps in that direction. but we have much further to go. So first, positive contact reduces stereotypes and prejudice. Secondly, positive contact reduces racial separation. Children, adolescents, and young adults who experience being together with people from different racial and ethnic groups are much more likely to live in racially integrated communities. They are much more likely to send their children to racially integrated schools. They are much more likely to worship in racially integrated houses of religion. Much less separation. Third, having the experience of diversity gives you the skills to work in diverse settings. And we live in a country and in a world where work settings are much more often diverse than they used to be, and they're going to continue to get more and more diverse. And in order to be an effective employee in such a work situation, having the experience of being together with people from different racial and ethnic groups is essential. In addition, having those experiences helps build cognitive skills, especially the ability to perceive and integrate multiple points of view. And lastly, people who work together in integrated settings make better decisions. Groups that are integrated make better decisions, more effective decisions, more fair decisions. One example is a study of college students who were put into two separate groups to be on mock juries. One group was homogeneously white, the second group was racially integrated. And they did all the things that mock juries do, and the question at the end of the study is, which of these groups made more effective decisions? And the answers were clear. The racially integrated group made fairer decisions, made more just decisions, paid closer attention to the evidence that was presented, remembered that evidence more effectively than the homogeneously white group. When they didn't remember something or when they made a mistake, they were quick to recover, quicker than the other group. So lots of benefits from racial diversity. Now, what do we mean by bringing people together in a positive way? The answer that has proven itself over many decades now to be the most effective way to do that is based on a theory generated by Professor Gordon Allport, social psychologist, building on the work of some other people, as is so often the case with scientific work. A number of people lay the groundwork, and then one person writes a book that takes off and everybody references it. And so this is often thought of as the intergroup contact theory of Gordon Allport, but there were a number of people that preceded Allport that made important contributions. But Allport's idea was that, yes, bringing people into contact with one another is important, but we have to do it under certain conditions, which we've put on this little visual for you. So the first condition is equal status. And what we mean by that is equal status in the situation of whatever the initiative might be. And I want to underline what Sandy was saying. The initiative might be talking to somebody that you are in class with or meeting for lunch with somebody who you work with. It doesn't have to be a big, complicated initiative, although we would love for you to get involved in big, complicated initiatives as well. Equal status in the situation. Everybody has an equal opportunity to participate in whatever it is that the group is doing to an equal degree. So if the group is, for example, a children's choir, everybody has an opportunity to audition to be a soloist. In our choir, we don't audition people to join. We welcome anybody who likes to sing. It helps if they can sing, but we don't have auditions. But in determining who's going to be a soloist, we have people sing, and whoever's going to be the most effective soloist, that person becomes the soloist, irrespective of what racial group they come from. It's not entirely true, actually. The only sense in which it's not true is that we want representatives from different social groups to be soloists. So even if somebody is not quite as talented a singer, but all the soloists are white at this point in time, then we will go out of our way to have our soloist group represent all of the different groups of the choir. So, kind of affirmative action in a sense, and I think well worth doing. But the idea is that everybody has an equal opportunity to be effective. If it's a football team, everybody has an equal opportunity to play in all of the positions, including quarterback, which used to be a whites-only position because coaches didn't think that black folks were smart enough to do the mental work of quarterbacking. Thankfully, that is no longer the case, and some wonderful African-American quarterbacks have emerged at all levels. But it's important to recognize the role of bias, conscious or unconscious, in determining decisions like who can be the quarterback. So the first condition is equal status. The second condition is personal acquaintance. It's important that people get to know one another. Just being in the same classroom, living in the same apartment complex, but never interacting, never getting to know one another personally is not going to bring about the desired results. There has to be personal acquaintance. 3, people need to do something together. And it doesn't much matter what that something is, but collaborating on a project of some kind is an important way for people to deal with each other in a stereotype-reducing way. Competing against one another, as happens in our area, where Benton Harbor High School, which is 98% African-American, and on the sports teams, almost entirely African-American, so to have those teams competing against all white teams is not an example of collaborative interaction. That kind of competition, if anything, is likely to reinforce stereotypes because you get into a mindset that the team you're playing against is your enemy. Being on the same team, and an example of that is the movie Remember the Titans, can make a difference in alleviating some of the stereotypes and prejudice that cause so many problems. And then the last condition is working together with people in the community who are in positions of authority. So in our community, we asked around initially when we were forming our children's choir, who are the people who are the most respected? And the answer was ministers. And so we made some contact with some local ministers who were very helpful in recruiting children from their church, one from Benton Harbor, one from St. Joe. We should take a minute. I'm assuming you all know about Benton Harbor is predominantly African American, St. Joe is predominantly white. Benton Harbor is one of the lowest income communities in the country. St. Joe is middle to upper class. So very different communities divided by the St. Joseph River and going by the name of the Twin Cities. And they couldn't be more different than twins, but they are right next to each other. So getting the help of people in authority makes a big difference, and that's been very helpful to us and our efforts. So we want to tell you about some of these initiatives to illustrate how these principles work. But again, I want to emphasize these principles apply not just to organized group initiatives, but to day-to-day behavior as well. So Sandy will start telling you some about some of the initiatives.
I think it's important to underscore that we're very aware, and a number of the organizations that we've worked in and with, and there's some examples from the Race Relations Council, address systemic bias, address the racism that still infects our society, the injustice that we see in our criminal justice system, the inequities we see in our educational system, the difference in the opportunities that our St. Joe kids have in what's available in their school in contrast to what our Benton Harbor kids have in their school is so startling. So some of the projects we work on directly address some of those inequities. The other projects strengthens people's commitment to do something, because having that personal acquaintance and recognizing the value in the person that's being shortchanged prompts you to roll up your sleeve and be an advocate for social justice. That knowing that other person's story develops a deeper level of empathy. And if we have a deeper level of empathy, we're more likely to be a staunch ally. Part of when Larry and I started to do some of this work, a close African-American friend said, you go at it, because it's not fair to ask people that are oppressed to educate the oppressor. He said, it's really important that you put time and energy and emotion into helping other people that enjoy white privilege understand the way the cards are stacked in the deck that we've all been playing with. So that strengthened our resolve. The race relations console that came out of that initial meeting we mentioned had an awards program to honor people that were trying to build bridges across that river. And the first time we had professional entertainment, and the second time I had this idea, why not bring these children who never know one another together across that bridge? Why not have them sing songs that give the message we want that audience to hear? And why not have their families involved as well? So not just the child, but the whole family joins the choir. And because we want them to have an opportunity for personal acquaintance, this isn't a drop your kid off choir. This is everybody come and stay, and the parents and grandparents cook the family style meal that we'll all have afterwards, so that we really do have a chance to know each other as human beings. And it was really important being cognizant of equal status and also our own limitations in beginning the choir, to know that we needed other leadership that represented the diversity in our area. So fortunately, in that first set of pastors, we were able to find choir directors from both sides of the river that were willing to lend their expertise. And Sister herself from Benton Harbor was our first partner, a talented African-American choir director that brought skills that I could only dream to have. So when the children would look at the directors from the outset, everybody saw somebody that looked sort of like them. So Hercel and I alternated directing. Larry played the banjo and the guitar and accompanied. Corey Hampton is an African-American, really talented gospel singer and director. He rounded out our quartet of leadership, so that what we were modeling is the friendships that we were learning to develop over time and the respect we all had for the different skill sets that we brought to bear. No auditions, everybody's welcome. We've had children with some real challenges. We've had hyperactive kids, kids on the spectrum. We've had kids with cerebral palsy. We're all a family under one sky. That's one of the kids' theme songs. And initially we thought we'd be serving 6 to 12-year-olds, but the little children learned the songs as well, and so we became 4 on, and then the blessing was that the big kids didn't leave, and so we have a teen part of our choir that does more sophisticated music before we bring the little ones on board. So it's ages 4 to 18, and there's no activity fee and no charge for transportation and no charge for your uniform. And we really function as a family. So we have birthday parties, and we go to each other's school events and soccer games, and an anonymous donor 5 years ago said, I can see that there's a kind of equity here that the rest of our community needs, and no one knows who are people that are more financially comfortable in this group until you get to the junior year of high school. And then the St. Joe kids are looking at all of their different college options, and most of the Benton Harbor kids can't afford to go to college. And so this anonymous benefactor deposited money under the care of the Berrien Community Foundation, and any child that grows up in the choir and stays through high school can have $10,000 for college. So for some of our families that have 3 children, that's $30,000 that makes college accessible to their young people, so that we can all be in this together. And one of our joys is watching the kids on Facebook stay in touch with each other through college scattered across the country. And some of them are godparents to each other's children. We see these wedding parties that look a lot like the choir family. So there's a ripple effect that those young people and their parents and their grandparents have had a chance to know each other in a situation that creates intimacy. And they're all seeing the link of their social responsibility. So they do make sure people get registered to vote, and they are the people that make sure that people have rides in Benton Harbor to get to the polls. Because social consciousness is raised when you know other human beings and what their story is like. The other group that we do is Calling All Colors. Calling All Colors actually began with one 9-year-old child at Coastal Carolina University. Many years ago, there was a racial incident. The college brought the adults in the community together. This little girl said to her mother, "Why doesn't anybody ever bring the children together?" So they made a Children's Day, and once a year down there, they still do that. We thought we needed more. And so we worked alongside with 5 other people initially to develop a program where children in grades 1, 2, 3, and 4 come together for a half-day experience. There's a large assembly, then we break them into small groups. Each child has a buddy from the other school. So there'll be 10 kids, 5 sets of buddies. Then they come together at the end of the morning for closing assembly. They come back together in a month or 2, and then they stay together via Skype in their classrooms. At the end of the year, they have a picnic and meet all their Calling All Colors buddies, and they bring their parents and introduce their parents to their friends. And it's been a very powerful experience. We begin in the assembly. They get off the buses from these 2 schools, and everybody looks really wary and uncomfortable. And the Benton Harbor kids are sizing up the St. Joe kids. Much of what you see with the St. Joe kids is some trepidation. They look really afraid of what this time is going to be like. And watching what happens over time, and when they come back from the buddy experience, and the games that we play that are designed to diminish stereotypes, is so striking, because they walk down the hall hesitant to leave the small group experience, often with their arm around their buddy. And that's who they want to sit with in the closing assembly. And it's a very powerful experience. So I said, as we do things like they reach into a bag where there are a bunch of adult shoes in the opening assembly when there's so much tension, and we have them walk across the room. And because they're huge grown-up shoes, they stumble and they fall, and then they start giggling. And we say, even to a first grader, we'll say, "Is there a lesson in this silly game? Is there something we could know because of what just happened?" And inevitably, some little kid says, "It's really hard to walk in somebody else's shoes." which opens the door so that we can begin to talk about how hard it is to really know what life is like for somebody that doesn't live in your neighborhood and doesn't go to your school. We eat diversity jelly beans, and they look like regular jelly belly beans. But when you bite in, the red one might actually be licorice, and the black one could be orange or lemon. And then when we say, is there something we could talk about jelly beans? Then inevitably a kid says, you can't tell on the outside what something will be like on the inside. So at our small group one day, I said, when we were ready to go back to the assembly, this is true for adults as well as children. When we go into something that's very different than our regular life, we often feel a little nervous. You feel a little worried. What will this be like? Who will these people be like? And so we try to guess. We try to imagine, what will happen today? And what will they be like? And sometimes it's just the way we imagined, but sometimes we're surprised. So could you take a minute and then tell me how you thought about what today would be and how you're feeling now? And they were quiet for a minute, and then a boy from Benton Harbor said, boy, I was surprised. I was real surprised. And I said, what surprised you? And he put the hand on the shoulder of the boy from St. Joe that was his buddy, and he looked him in the eye and he said, I was surprised you liked me. And the St. Joe boy said, I was surprised you liked me. And then the other 6 kids all said, I didn't think they'd like us. I didn't think she'd like me. And so when I'm pleading with people that decide who gets a grant, I always say, we're going to keep doing this till nobody's surprised. So I'm going to let Larry tell you about the adult initiatives.
So we want to take a few minutes to tell you about 2 of the initiatives for adults. And again, as a way of illustrating how these principles can be put into action. In this instance, in a large group, but it doesn't have to be a large group. So the Race Relations Council formed the night that we went there to go one time, and it's now 20 years later, and we've gone 1 million times. And we decided to focus on projects of one kind or another. The first project that we focused on, this is 20 years ago, was what to do about the fact that the Ku Klux Klan had decided that St. Joseph, Michigan was a community that they should come to and hold a rally because they thought that the people of St. Joseph were ripe for recruiting into the Klan. So we talked a lot about what's the best way to deal with this. Some people thought we should hold a counter rally in the same space as the Klan rally. Some people thought we should ignore it completely. One minister in the Benton Harbor community decided that he would like to hold a prayer service at his church at the exact same time as the Klan rally was being held in St. Joe. We thought that was a good idea. We wrote a letter to the editor urging people to attend this prayer service, also urging them to get involved with people from the other community in some of the ways that we've talked with you about today. On the day of the rally, the Klan did show up in St. Joe. There were about a dozen people there. Half those people were supporters of the Klan, and the other half were protesters against the Klan. In Benton Harbor, a couple of hundred people came to this prayer service from both sides of the river, and for that couple of hours on that particular day, it really felt like we lived in Dr. King's beloved community, with black and white folks being in a prayer service together saying, what these people are doing is not okay, we won't have that in our community. Now, as is often the case, One experience like that doesn't change the community, but it was helpful, and it gave those of us who were working in the Race Relations Council a boost. There are things that we can do that can really make a difference. So the next thing we did is that we developed a questionnaire, and we asked people in the community to fill it out and asked a whole bunch of questions about how often do you have communications with people from racial or ethnic groups different than your own? How often do you get together for a meal? How often do you do something else? And then a bunch of questions about attitudes. How do you feel about people from a different group, et cetera. And we gave that questionnaire to 3 groups: high school students in Benton Harbor and St. Joseph, adult church members in each of those 2 communities, and students at one of our 2 local community colleges, Lake Michigan College. And briefly, the results were that the high school students essentially had nothing to do with one another, and didn't have particularly positive attitudes about the other group. Similar findings with the adult church members, almost no interaction at all, and middling attitudes. But the students at the community college had really gotten to know each other across racial and ethnic lines and had developed personal relationships. Not everybody, not to the degree that one might ideally hope it could be, but significantly different from either of those other 2 groups. And it turns out that this is the first opportunity that people from these communities have to interact in a personal kind of way, to really be with one another and really have a chance to get to know one another. So that was encouraging, and the college really is the beacon of opportunity for people to really cross racial lines and get to know one another. We next looked at lending practices. People in Benton Harbor had been telling us that it's so hard to get a loan for a home improvement loan. They want to fix up their house and the banks are not willing to give them a loan. So we partnered with a group from Chicago, the Woodstock Institute, that specializes in looking at lending disparities. And it turned out that people from the same income group, people who made the same amount of money, in these 2 communities were having very different experiences getting loans to either buy a house or especially to improve the property that they already lived in. It was much easier for somebody from the white community of St. Joe to get a loan than from the predominantly black community of Benton Harbor. So we thought that was not a good thing, and we wrote up our results, and they were published on the front page of the local newspaper. And then we met with the lenders, who, as you can imagine, were not entirely happy that we had publicized this disparity in lending practices. And they told us that the reason that this was true is because in Benton Harbor, the surrounding houses in that neighborhood were not worth enough for them to be willing to take the risk of giving a loan to somebody in that neighborhood who wanted to improve their property. And we thought that was a terrible catch-22. How in the world is a neighborhood ever going to improve itself if you won't help somebody who wants to get the ball rolling by fixing up their house and maybe inspiring some of their neighbors to do the same thing? So that was our next project. We then went on to work with other groups in the community. In the criminal justice domain, in our area, there had not been a public defender office. And the way that people who couldn't afford to hire an attorney got representation is that the county hired private attorneys and gave them much too big of a workload so that they were meeting with people in the courthouse in the hallway for 5 minutes prior to going in for an arraignment, and almost invariably suggesting that they do a plea bargain. We thought that wasn't a great way to do it, and lots of other people in the community agreed with us. So we all lobbied, and finally a public defender office was established and has now been going for a couple of years. And clearly it's a much more level playing field. Not totally level. The budget for the prosecutor's office is still many times as high as the budget for the public defender's office, but It's better than it used to be. And lastly, we consulted with the local hospital who had been receiving a lot of complaints about racial discrimination. We met with them, we talked with them about how to make that better. They established a diversity office with a head of diversity, and they've been moving forward. So a lot of things can happen when a determined group of people, not a huge group, or maybe a group of 20 people, but if you're determined and if you put some energy into it, some important things can happen, especially when there are other people you can collaborate with. So the other thing we wanted to just talk briefly with you about is the course, the Psychology of Stereotyping and Prejudice, that we teach at Lake Michigan College together initially, and now I teach it by myself because Sandy is busy doing other important things. And we want to just share with you a couple of stories. This is focuses on all forms of prejudice and stereotypes, not just race, but race is an important part of it. And there are a couple of stories about racial stereotypes and prejudice that we want to share with you. So Sandy will go first, and then I'll go second, and then we would love to hear your questions and comments.
We keep the class small so that it's kind of a seminar, and that we talk initially about the fact that all of us have blind spots, that all of us hold some unconscious prejudices and hold some stereotypes. We're immersed in a society where there are a lot of false beliefs about many groups, and it's impossible to emerge unscathed. And we try to set the tone in the very beginning of the class by telling a story on ourselves, telling a story about a blind spot we had, so that we make it okay to be wrong, and we ask people to be brave at looking at their own blind spots and the false beliefs that may limit the richness of the life they have. And initially you can see people dip their toe in the water and tell stories that are pretty safe. The first time we run into significant opposition in the class is when we try to teach the classic article about white privilege. And then many of the students in the class tell us about how their own family has had to struggle to make it. And I think that it's really hard if you're part of the majority to see all of the ways that the door opens wider for you and the barriers that other people have to deal with every day. What we say in the groups that we've been in Healing Racism and in the Race Relations Council and in our class is that we want people to become constructively self-conscious. You know, being self-conscious has a bad name. You know, nobody wants to feel self-conscious. But if we're going to make things different in a society that's full of bias, we do have to be constructively self-conscious, so that when you walk up to buy something in the department store and you see that there's a person of color or a person in a hijab, or you see that there's somebody that's been waiting there and the salesperson is behaving as though they're invisible, but as you approach the counter, the person comes over to wait on you, be cognizant that somebody else is being overlooked so that you can be taken care of. And make sure in that moment in time that you're identifying whose turn it is, and that you see this other human being who is not invisible and who deserves recognition. So that's a small way that each of us can make a difference in our regular day-to-day life, because once you're thinking about it, you see it all over the place. So the story that happened in our class that I was thinking about the other day that was so powerful for me was about 2/3 of the way through the semester. And our students are varied ages. Some are typical college age, but we also have some adults that are returning to school. And we have some people whose workplace has done some testing about bias, and They have been troubled by the results because they didn't see themselves as harboring any bias, and so they've come to see what they could learn in our class. So this is a fella who's middle-aged, and he haltingly said that he wanted to share a story, and that it was a story he hadn't told in 40 years, and that it had been haunting him for 40 years. That he grew up in the South, his family had a great deal of money, they were very involved in country clubs, that the person that took care of him every day, that made his lunch, that listened to how his day was after school, that was always there with a hug, was a black woman, his nanny, as they called her. And that was the woman that was his rock. She was the predictable one. She was the one that he knew he could count on. So he came home from school one day really excited because one of the popular boys who lived across town had invited him for a play date. But his folks, as usual, weren't available to take him to the play date, and there was no way he could get there. And his nanny said, "I'll be glad to drive you." So he was enthused and grateful, hopped in the car next to her. She turned on the station they always listened to on the radio. They were singing, and he had told her about his day. They get to the street, they pull down, and they see that in the median, a number of the kids that live on that all-white block are playing together, and that his friend's house is at the end of the block. And as he realizes that he's leaning up against this woman that he loves, and they're going to see him in that situation, he suddenly pretends that his shoe's untied, and he bends as far as he can so he can't be seen from the street. And he stays that way till he gets in front of the house. And as he moves up to step out of the car, he catches a look of her face in the corner of his eye, and there's a tear running down her cheek. And she didn't say anything. And he hopped out of the car, but he teared up in class as he told the story and said, "We never talked about it again, but I never forgot. I never forgot that the person that loved me the most, that was the most predictable in my life, the one I could count on, I betrayed in that moment. I didn't want to deal with being teased. I didn't want my friends to make a judgment about me. So I did the cowardly thing and I hid out. And I have felt so guilty ever since, and I've never been able to speak about it." And what was powerful that happened in response to that is two of the black students were among the first to reach out to him and say, "You were a kid. You were a kid in the South. You were programmed to respond in those ways. But you're a man who's struggling to be the best man you can be. That's why you're in this class. And you gotta let go of this, man. You gotta let go of it." And we could sense in the camaraderie that had developed in the class that there was a forgiveness that this man had needed, and it strengthened his resolve. The last paper that the students write in our class is not based on reading and research in the traditional way. We say, now that you've been looking at this question of stereotypes and prejudice and implicit bias, you know what groups you've been harboring some prejudice against. You know what stereotypes you've been holding. So your assignment is to find someone in that group, and your research paper is to learn their story. You need to spend a couple hours with them, and you need to ask them a whole series of questions. What was growing up like? When was the first time you felt the impact of bias? So some of the people chose folks from a different racial or ethnic group, and some of the people chose LGBT folks, and some of the people chose folks with disabilities. Some of the people chose Jewish folks because they realized that they had harbored some anti-Semitism. But people had to sit in that discomfort of hearing the story of someone that they had previously judged, even without knowing them.
One last story, also from the class. This was a student from the local seminary. Andrews University is near us, and sometimes their seminary students take our course. And this is about 3/4 of the way through the course. This is a white man who said to us, "You know, my family lives at some distance from here. I don't remember now where. And every holiday I go home, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and the entire family gathers. My grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins. And invariably in the course of those experiences, one or more people will begin telling racist jokes. And people laugh at the jokes. I don't laugh, but I also don't say anything. And every time I leave and come back to school, I feel like I've lost a piece of my soul. And I'm not going to do that anymore. The next time when that happens, I am going to say something. And people may get mad at me, and people may tell me I'm speaking out of turn, and people may not want to have anything more to do with me. But I'm not going to lose any more parts of my soul." And so we started brainstorming in class, how can you do that? How can you speak up in a way that is from your feelings, that isn't attacking anybody, that isn't shaming anybody, although you hope that in the course of the discussion they will begin to feel some shame. But what techniques could you use to say, this feels bad to me, I don't think this is right, I think this is a wrong thing to do? And we talked about it, and we came up with some good possibilities. And so hopefully we can all speak up. We don't need to see things happening that are discriminatory and do nothing. There are a whole variety of things that we can do, and hopefully will. So there's much else in the book that we don't have time to talk with you about, but I want to just briefly say that we have a chapter about what can parents do, what can teachers do, what can adults do in day-to-day life, in addition to talking about the initiatives that we've talked with you about. So we'd love to hear from you, questions or comments.
Larry, you know, the one other thing that I want to mention is how phobic so many of us are about having hard conversations. That years ago, I went to a continuing education program for therapists, and the expert that worked with us for the weekend was Earl Grolman, who's a PhD psychologist and a Reform rabbi, and he was Fred Rogers' best friend. And he wrote all of the psychological content for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And one of the things that Earl said to us was, part of your job is to help people talk about the hard things. And one of the phrases that he left us with was, whatever is mentionable is manageable. Whatever is mentionable is manageable. That we're afraid to talk about all of the isms, racism, sexism, homophobia. We're afraid to talk about learning disabilities. We're afraid to talk about the impact of divorce. We're anxious about dealing with the hard things. But it's the conversation that we have about the hard things that helps us get in it in order to get through it, in order to be over it. And I think that's part of why it's so important for us to do the hard work of addressing the differences and the common threads that run between the fabrics of our lives. Because we're both psychotherapists, Larry's a psychiatrist, I'm a clinical social worker, there is some psychological content in our book too, where we talk about why are people resistant to facing their own implicit bias? What gets in the way? Why do we hold so tenaciously to those beliefs? Why are we in denial about the things that need to be addressed? So I think that just raising our consciousness to let me look at myself more honestly, more candidly, because we don't escape it. It's so important to keep it in mind. And even if you're part of a minority group, you can absorb the stereotypical beliefs about that group. One of our close friends in the Race Relations Council told us about having a dinner with some colleagues in St. Joe, and it was dusk, and she was walking down the street, and at the end of the block, she saw a bunch of teenage boys or young adult boys, African American, and she's talking to her friends, and she sees these boys at a distance, and she says to her friends, I think let's cross the street and walk on this side. And as they got to the end of the block, she hears out of the center of that pack of kids, hey, Mom, why'd you cross the street? And it was her son and his friends in that group of boys. But in that moment, that belief that groups of young adult or teenage black boys are a threat, that somehow she'd absorbed that too. And so we've got to be cognizant of what do I think about the other, and what do I think about who I am? Thank you.